things can be true at the same time. Yes, I am grieved.
Kirk was assassinated September 10th of 2025. Here you'll see this order under Erika Kirk, September 11th, 2025 at 11:10 a.m. 1040.
Something about this story doesn't sit right. Not because of what happened, but because of what happened after. Everyone remembers the moment the news broke. It spread fast. Shock, confusion, people trying to piece together what just happened. And for a while, that's all anyone focused on. The tragedy, the loss, the unanswered questions surrounding it. But then, less than a day later, something small surfaced, almost insignificant at first. Just a timestamp, a purchase, a number on a receipt. And that's when everything shifted, because people weren't just looking at what happened anymore. They started looking at her. Why would someone, in the middle of something so devastating, do something so normal, so routine, or maybe not so normal at all?
At first, some brushed it off. People grieve differently. Shock can make you act in unexpected ways. That's what many said. And for a moment, that explanation held. But then more details started coming out. And suddenly, that one small moment didn't feel so small anymore. Because it wasn't just a timing. It was what the timing seemed to suggest. And that's when people began asking a question that hasn't gone away since. Was this really just grief? Or was something else going on? But that's not where it ends, because that receipt, that was just the beginning.
The receipt became a focal point almost overnight, not because of what was purchased, but because of when. Less than 24 hours. That's the number people couldn't stop repeating. Some argued it meant nothing, that grief doesn't follow rules, that people cope in ways that don't always make sense from the outside. And they're not wrong. There's no universal timeline for how someone should act. But others weren't convinced, because it wasn't just a quiet, private moment. It was something that could be tracked, something that left a digital footprint, a record, a timestamp that people could point to and say, look, this happened. And once that detail got out, the conversation changed. Suddenly, it wasn't about sympathy anymore. It was about perception. People started asking uncomfortable questions, questions that didn't have easy answers. Why that day? Why that moment? Why so soon? And then came the deeper layer. Because for some, it wasn't just about the purchase itself, it was about what it represented. To them, it felt disconnected, detached, almost like the emotional reaction didn't match the situation. But here's where things take a turn. Because the more people talked about that moment, the more they started noticing other things, patterns, behavior, timing. And that's when the focus shifted again. Because now it wasn't just about a receipt anymore. It was about everything that came after it. At first, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Public appearances, statements, the expected responses, nothing that stood out too much. But then, slowly, something changed. The visibility increased, the presence became stronger, more frequent, more public. And people noticed. Because before all of this, she wasn't really in the spotlight. Not like this. Not constantly. Not at this level. But suddenly, she was everywhere. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. Some saw it as strength, as stepping up when it mattered most, taking control during a difficult time. But others saw something different. To them, it felt fast, too fast. Like the transition happened almost overnight. And that's when people started asking another question. Was this a natural progression or something that had already been set in motion? Because timing matters, and in this case, the timing raised eyebrows. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the more visible she became, the more people started looking back. Not forward, back. Back at old interviews, old clips, old statements. And that's when things really started to unravel, because what they found didn't always line up. The rise was undeniable. New roles, new influence, new responsibilities. And on paper, it looked like a logical next step. Someone stepping into a position after a major loss, filling a gap, continuing a legacy. But not everyone saw it that way. because for critics, the speed of it all didn't make sense. Positions that usually take years to reach, suddenly happening in a much shorter time frame. And that raised a different kind of question. Not emotional this time, but structural. How does someone move that quickly into that level of influence? Supporters had an answer. They said it was earned, that she had been involved behind the scenes longer than people realized, that this was simply the moment the public caught up. But skeptics weren't convinced, because from their perspective, it looked like a leap, not a step. And leaps like that tend to attract attention. But that's not even the most interesting part. Because as people started debating her rise, others were digging into something else entirely, her past. And that's when things started getting complicated. The internet has a pattern. When something doesn't make sense, people start digging. Old videos resurface, old interviews get rewatched. Small details that once went unnoticed suddenly become important. And that's exactly what happened here. Clips from years ago started circulating, statements that on their own didn't seem like much, but when compared side by side, they told a slightly different story. Different versions, different details, small inconsistencies. Nothing definitive, nothing that proves anything on its own, but enough to make people pause, because consistency builds trust, and inconsistency creates doubt. And once doubt enters the conversation, it spreads fast. People began questioning things they never questioned before. Background, personal history, even simple details about upbringing. At first, it seemed minor, easy to dismiss, but then more examples appeared, and suddenly it didn't feel so minor anymore. Because now it wasn't just one detail, it was a pattern, and patterns are hard to ignore. But this is where the story takes a different turn. Because once the internet starts seeing patterns, it doesn't stop there. It starts building theories. The theory didn't start as something serious. At first, it was just speculation. A comment here, a post there, but then it spread because the idea itself was compelling. The suggestion that there was more going on behind the scenes, that certain events weren't as random as they appeared. And once that idea took hold, people began connecting dots. Some pointed to the timeline, others pointed to the sudden rise, others to the inconsistencies in past statements. And from that, a narrative started forming, a controversial one. Now, it's important to be clear. This is speculation. There is no confirmed evidence supporting these claims.
But that didn't stop the conversation, because in the world of online discourse, possibility is often enough. And the more people talked about it, the more it evolved. What started as a question turned into a theory, and what started as a theory started influencing how people viewed everything else. But here's the part that made it even more intense. Because the theory didn't exist in isolation, it connected to something bigger, something deeper, and that's when things escalated again.
Once the conversation shifted toward connections, it opened a completely new door. Because now people weren't just looking at one person, they were looking at networks, relationships, background ties. Family connections became a topic of discussion, not as facts, but as points of curiosity. People began mapping things out, trying to understand how different pieces might fit together. And in doing so, they started noticing overlaps. Again, nothing confirmed, nothing officially verified, but enough to keep the conversation alive. Because when multiple questions start pointing in the same direction, even without answers, it creates momentum. And momentum is powerful. At this point, the narrative had completely shifted. This was no longer just about a single moment or a single decision. It had become something much bigger, a story filled with questions, gaps, and competing interpretations. Some saw coincidence, others saw intention, and neither side was backing down. But here's what makes it even more complicated, because the more people tried to find answers, the less clear things became. Right now, there are more questions than answers. Some people believe this is all being blown out of proportion, that grief, timing, and public pressure created a narrative that spiraled out of control. Others believe the opposite,
that the details we've seen are just the surface, and that something deeper hasn't been revealed yet. And that divide isn't going away anytime soon, because both sides are looking at the same events and seeing completely different stories. One sees coincidence, the other sees a pattern. And the truth? It's somewhere in the middle, or maybe somewhere we haven't even looked yet. Because despite everything that's been discussed, everything that's been analyzed, there's still something missing. A piece that doesn't quite fit. A question that hasn't been fully answered. And maybe that's why this story hasn't faded, because it doesn't feel finished. It feels incomplete. So the real question is, are people reading too much into this? Or are they just starting to notice something they weren't supposed to see?